And so I said, if we're going to do effective advocacy, we have to understand what that looks like. And we have to gain that understanding by talking to pimps and traffickers to ask what would deter them. So I raised $30,000 and got a team of amazing researchers. And we interviewed 115, I think it was, purchasers of sex.
Welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast. It's your girl, Kate, here. This is the place to find inspiring stories of world-changing women and girls every single week. We have a new, unique story coming your way every single week, so make sure that you subscribe to the One Girl Revolution podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and everywhere you listen to podcasts. Also, please share this episode that you're listening to. Share all of our episodes. Share this podcast with your friends, your family, and on social media. Every single share helps us continue our mission. Also, check out our website, onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com to find all of our over 185 episodes of the podcast. Please listen to all of them and share them. Watch our Emmy-nominated documentaries. Donate to our nonprofit organization to help us continue our critical work to elevate women's voices and their stories, and so much more. Go to onegirlrevolution.com today. Now, today on the One Girl Revolution podcast, I welcome Rachel Durchslag, founder of Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, aka CAASE. I marked this episode as explicit solely because of the topic, because it may not be suitable for all audiences. But I do encourage every adult to listen and to consider sharing this episode with others. It's such an important topic that really breaks down the topic of human trafficking and sexual exploitation in a new way. CAASE was created after Rachel saw a powerful documentary that opened her eyes to the epidemic of human trafficking in our world. But the premise to start CAASE was incredibly interesting and innovative. As Rachel shares in this episode, if they were going to start something, it needed to be new and innovative. And if they were going to do advocacy, they needed to go straight to the source, the purchasers. If you can bring an end to the demand, you can bring an end to human trafficking. CAASE has made an incredible impact and continues to do so. Rachel has since moved on from CAASE and has started Emerge Asheville, a healing practice which strives to help people connect more deeply with themselves, their lives, and the joy and spaciousness of this life. Rachel is incredibly vulnerable in this episode and shares how CAASE and the work she was doing, rightfully so, led to burnout, and she needed to walk away and pass the organization on to others. At Emerge, Rachel uses her own experience to help others who often suffer from tremendous burnout, nonprofit leaders, teachers, first responders, and so many others find healing, hope, and life, find their life again. Rachel is also an author. We talk about her book in this episode. She's an adventurer. She shares about her experience on the Camino and other adventures. You will be so inspired by Rachel, and she will be a healing and loving presence in your ears, to your ears. You don't want to miss this episode. Here's my conversation with Rachel. Rachel, welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
So I have done a lot of work. One Girl Revolution has done a lot of work in Chicago. And I feel like a couple of years ago, I stumbled upon CAASE and read about your story and then never had you on the podcast. And so I feel like it's very providential that finally I'm having you on the podcast. I know that you're not with CAASE anymore, but I want to talk about, how you founded it and the whole story behind that and then what you're doing now. But I'm just really excited to share your story with our audience.
Thank you. I really am too. It's an honor.
So before we get into CAASE and all the work that you're doing now, I would love to rewind. I am a firm believer in telling the evolution story, right? Our stories are full of so many chapters and twists and turns. So I would love to rewind and hear a little bit about you, who you are, where you're from, and just kind of your life growing up.
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in Chicago, and I was raised in a family that was based around the legacy of my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather was a Lithuanian immigrant with an 8th grade education who came to the United States and lived the American dream. He built a business. He made a lot of money in pastries. And when he died, he left every single cent that he had to charity. And he did it in the form of a family foundation. So when I grew up, I had this privilege of being surrounded with the idea that anytime that you had any type of resource or privilege in your life, it was your obligation to be able to go out into the world and do healing work. So that was the fabric of my upbringing. And as a little girl, everything was about, volunteering with different Jewish organizations and finding ways to give back to the community. So I feel like that was the air that I breathed, the food that I ate growing up. So it wasn't surprising later in life that I felt really called to dedicating my life to making the world a more healed place.
And then you went to college. Can you talk to me a little bit about college and maybe kind of what started your journey towards CAASE and the work that you've done in advocacy?
I went to Skidmore College in upstate New York, and I had no idea what I wanted to be. And both of my roommates were taking a social work class. So I thought, well, at least I can practice doing the homework with them. So I signed up for social work. And when I started kind of studying the ways that we could make the world better, something just lit up in me. And I thought, this is what I want to do, but I don't want to do it on an individual level. I want to change systems. And then when things really changed for me is I came back to Chicago. I worked with the National Organization for Women. And I went out one night to see a film. This was in 2003 about human trafficking. And I had never heard about human trafficking before. And the film was about a woman who was trafficked from Eastern Europe to Chicago. So of course there was some resonance there for me because I recognized, had that heart for my city. And I was shocked that this happened and thought, as an informed feminist, how do I not know about this? So I started to do research and found that Chicago was one of the top destinations that traffickers brought their victims. And I thought, if I don't know about this as an informed feminist, I'm guessing many people don't know about this. So it became my passion to really bring the awareness about this issue into the world. And I realized very quickly that to do it effectively, I needed more education. So I went to the University of Chicago to get my master's in social service administration so that I could couple the passion with some actual tangible skills to make a difference in the field.
What you experienced, and I'm in Detroit, so Detroit, Chicago, people don't think about how prevalent human trafficking is in our culture, in our world, but specifically in these places where there's so many freeways, we're really close to Canada, traffickers can get people out of the country quickly, and people don't talk about it. We don't think that it's happening because we don't see it, right? But then once you're informed, which I know this is your experience, once you see something, you can't unsee it. So even you seeing that in the film, and then I know like the more you do that work, the more you start to see and you start to notice things in the culture, in your daily life, but also in the culture, on social media, on things that are happening in our world, and you just can't unsee it. And so it kind of lights a fire to do more.
Absolutely. And for me, one of the most transformative experiences is after I started to learn more about the issue, get passionate, I wanted to challenge myself. I said, it's one thing to be comfortable at home and be on the computer and send, legislative support, but it's another thing to actually be in the trenches. And so I went to Thailand and I worked with young girls who had been kidnapped or sold into the sex industry. Young girls, 8, 9 years old, many of them infected with HIV, many of them mothers at a very young age from their experience in the sex trade industry. And what became so clear to me is that the situations that make people vulnerable to trafficking, poverty, sexual abuse, drug addiction, unstable family structures. Dealing with those issues is going to take generations. So trying to solve human trafficking by rescuing every victim it's not effective because there's thousands of other victims that will easily be plucked by traffickers. So what Thailand taught me was that if we don't go upstream on this issue, we're never actually going to have a sustainable impact. So I thought, well, what if we went after the demand? What if we stopped just looking at the victims and thought, if we could prevent men from purchasing the bodies of vulnerable women and girls, could we actually have an impact on this struggle? And we looked to other countries, and Sweden had the biggest reduction in human trafficking rates because they said, we're going to treat people in the industry as victims. We're not going to arrest them. We're actually going to give them services and resources. Instead, we're going to take our criminal justice focus and put it on the pimps and traffickers so that it's no longer tolerable for people in Sweden to purchase sex. And their sex trade numbers plummeted. So when I started CAASE, I said to myself, don't go downstream with your solutions, do something radical, focus on the demand. And we were the first organization in the country to have that as our focus.
Wow, that's incredible. So when you started CAASE, what made you say, this is something bigger than just me or getting a couple of my friends to do some advocacy work? I want to start an organization and I want this to be a strong, multifaceted approach. What was that moment, or was there a moment?
It was the exact opposite moment. I thought, I never want to run in an organization. That sounds like the worst idea ever. I hate fundraising. But my passion for ending human trafficking was so strong, and the field was so much in its infancy that there were no jobs. And so I said, oh, well, you can work in domestic violence or you can do anti-sexual assault work. But my heart kept saying no. And I remember the moment when I kind of had that wake up call. There's something called the Players Ball, at least there was when I was in the field, where every year famous pimps throughout the country throw themselves a big party. It's disgusting. And they bring in women on dog collars, and it's just a real gross display of misogyny and exploitation. And the year after I graduated, they were holding it in Chicago, across from a police station, just to show you how much immunity pimps and traffickers have. And so I was out with the advocates, and we were, protesting, and we were filming, and we were, just doing everything we could to raise awareness. And I got in my car after that protest and I started sobbing, because I realized that I had no choice but to work in this field because it was what my soul wanted to do. And so then I begrudgingly said, I guess I have to start my own nonprofit because there's nothing out there that's going to allow me to do this work.
Well, you've really raised up a revolution through CAASE. And I know there's such a huge impact that you've made and that CAASE makes and continues to make. Tell me about CAASE. What is CAASE? And tell me all the different facets of the work that CAASE does.
Absolutely. So when we started to do work on demand, we were so excited. We're going to do this revolutionary, really exciting work. And then we're like, so what does the research say about how to deter demand? And what we found was there was no research. There were thousands of studies on women in the sex trade industry, and there was one on purchasers of sex. And so I said, if we're going to do effective advocacy, we have to understand what that looks like. And we have to gain that understanding by talking to pimps and traffickers to ask what would deter them. So I raised $30,000 and got a team of amazing researchers. And we interviewed 115, I think it was, purchasers of sex. And that research helped formulate what CAASE would become. And what the men told us when we asked about why they did what they did and what would actually deter them were a couple of things. The first is they said, if someone had come and talked to me when I was a young man about the sex trade, everything I knew about the sex trade was from MTV and movies and glamorized and family members. No one told me about the harm. No one told me about the real lived life experiences of these people. I wish someone had. And so I said, great, let's create the country's first curriculum for only boys to go in and talk about constructs of masculinity, to talk about pressures around sexual involvement, and then to talk about the sex trade industry. And then let's mandate that the end of our curriculum be an action step that the boys come up with on their own, that then we help them implement. Because it's not enough just to learn. You have to build a bridge to action. So that was the first thing that we do is the curriculum. Then a lot of the men said, if I had just known more about this, perhaps I wouldn't have started. So we said, okay, we need a community awareness campaign. And again, not just to raise awareness, but to create tools so community members can take action. So we created a plethora of action tools for religious groups, for massage therapists, for school age people, anybody who said we'd love some help, we created a toolkit for them because I wanted people to be empowered to take a stance against human trafficking. And then the third thing we really realized is that these men needed to be held accountable in the legal system. One of the most powerful answers we received to why do you buy sex is a man who looked me in the eyes and said, because I can, because there's no consequences. So we worked with it. We created an amazing policy team. And by the time I left, we had already passed 4 or 5 laws. And I can't even imagine how many have been passed now to shift the focus away from criminalizing, especially youth, but also individuals who are prostituted, and shifting that focus onto the demand side.
That's incredible. And it's really taking this multifaceted cultural approach, right? Like we all have opinions about like why we have human trafficking in the world or why someone is working in the sex industry. We all make these judgments every single day about what their life looks like. And the reality is it's multifaceted. There's usually, especially when it comes to women, and I've seen this even with incarceration and women that I've worked with in the justice system, where there's almost always, with women, it's interesting. There's always another motivating factor, right? Women don't just go in to rob a bank, or women don't just, most of the time, just get into the sex industry. There's usually something else going on, whether it was abuse, or a pimp or a boyfriend, or somehow there's some other motivating factor. And people don't talk about that, right, Rachel? It's like people don't talk about it. It's like we have this human trafficking is this kind of far-fetched thing. Like, you know, people talk about it very like high level, but we don't get into the nitty-gritty of it. And what I love that you're doing is you guys just took the bull by the horns and you were like, let's talk about this and let's find solutions to end the demand.
And I think one of the things I was most proud of, because I'm not a survivor of prostitution or human trafficking, so my knowledge is limited to what I've learned. And so I created an advisory council of survivors. So we had a group of about 10 women who had been in the sex trade industry, and they kind of vetted all of our activism and all of our initiatives to let us know what would work, what didn't, what was culturally sensitive, what had blind spots. And so they were really the driving force behind the work that we did.
Donate to One Girl Revolution's nonprofit organization to help us continue our work, highlighting inspiring women and girls that are changing the world through their lives, promoting their work and their organizations, and building a powerful and positive force out in the world dedicated to empowering women, their voices, and their stories. Donate at onegirlrevolution.com/donate. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com/donate. Rachel, is there a story, and I know you just shared one there, but is there a story or two of the work that you've done? And it could be an individual that was helped through your work, a story that you know, or maybe it was one of the bigger things, right? Passing a bill. Is there something, a story that you could share that really you feel like embodies why CAASE is so important, and really embodies the power of the work that you do?
Absolutely. One of the things I'm most proud of is up until, I forget what year we passed the legislation, but in all 50 states, youth were being prosecuted for prostitution. Youth who cannot consent to having a sexual relationship with an adult were nonetheless being arrested and put into the judicial system, the criminal justice system, for being exploited. It was so backwards and so unjust. And so through our policy work, through our legislation that we introduced, Illinois became the first state. I mean, this is crazy to state, the first state in the country to stop arresting and prosecuting children for being harmed in the sex trade industry. So that's an example of something that I'm really proud that we did.
It's incredible. And then that has ripple effects, right? Other states see what you're doing. And I would say that even about like activism or advocacy, when other people see what we're doing, or they hear about what they're doing and they're like, oh, I could do that too. That's what this podcast is all about, is sharing these stories of human beings. You know, we're all in this together, and people that are like, yeah, I don't have the money, or I don't have the time, or I can't. The reality is we can all do something. And I think one thing with human trafficking is there's so much that we can do. And it's just the little things can have a massive impact too.
Absolutely. And one of the toolkits that I'm most proud of is called 10 Issues and 10 Actions You Can Take for 100 Ways to End Human Trafficking. And that's on the CAASE website. And again, it's just little everyday things that anyone can do to really make a difference on this issue. Because I think people read about human trafficking and they think, well, that's horrible, but where's my role in that? You know, I'm not somebody who does policy work. I can maybe make a donation, but I'm not a social worker. So we really wanted to put that power back into people's hands so that they realize that everyone has a role to play.
And it's knowledge, right? We all have a responsibility to know what's going on in our culture and in our world. And I think for some people, things seem to change when they have kids and they're like, oh, actually, now I have to pay attention to things that are happening in the world in a different way. But the reality is there's so much going on and we need to know, we need to educate ourselves. And it doesn't just end when school ends for us. We need to constantly be learning, and the world is only going to become better the more that we know and the more that we can advocate and speak fluently on these issues.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the most basic things that all of us can do is that we can put the number for the human trafficking hotline in our phones and just memorize a couple of the warning signs. Somebody who doesn't have their papers, somebody who seems to be under the control of the person that they're with, someone who's working, hours that seem like they're exploited, and make the phone call, because so many victims are identified by everyday people being able to identify them and reaching out to get them help.
I had a woman, Jan is her name, and she runs this amazing shelter for survivors of domestic violence out of Texas. And I had her on the podcast, and she was telling me about, she even like in airports will look for situations. She just keeps her eyes wide open, looks for situations of domestic violence. And she's had instances where she's gone up to a woman or to a couple and been like, hey, is everything okay? And sometimes there have been a few times where she's not necessarily been embarrassed, but she was wrong. It wasn't a situation. It just was a couple that was in a heated moment. But she inspired me so much, Rachel, because I was like, the worst thing that could happen is you could be wrong. And so if you see something, say something, call the hotline. The worst thing that could happen is like, whatever, it was a boyfriend and a girlfriend. But what happens if you don't say something and you don't call?
Right. Exactly. And then that person is, in this harmful situation because we were scared to take action.
I will be sure to post the phone number that you mentioned there. And I encourage everybody who's listening to put it in their phone, like you said. And then also I will link to CAASE's website, and I'll link to the document, a couple of the documents that you've mentioned so far, so people can easily find it. So I want to transition into the next part of your story. So you ended up transitioning out of CAASE.
Yes.
What happened there? What was the reasoning? I know it can be really difficult, the work that you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with human trafficking, and you poured your heart and life into CAASE in a lot of ways. But what was the kind of turning point for you to leave? And then talk to me about what you're doing now.
Sure. I think kind of there are two pieces to my leaving story. One is that it's really hard to talk about sexual harm all day, every day for 7 years. It hurts your heart. It makes the world look less safe. It leads to burnout. And when I was running CAASE in the early 2000s, we didn't really have a kind of national dialogue around self-care. Self-care was get a pedicure every now and then. Self-care was burn out, but then go on a 2-day vacation, but then come right back into a broken system where you burn out again. So I was burnt out. I was exhausted. I was making myself sick. And I started feeling my heart close, like I could feel a little jaded almost, not about the issue, just kind of being in the nonprofit world and the intensity and the expectation that you would be a martyr. I always joke that the nonprofit world can sometimes feel like martyr Olympics, where it's like, well, I only slept 2 hours last night because I was working so hard. Well, I haven't taken a vacation in 10 years because I'm so committed. And like, that's a really broken system because we break the people who were supposed to be making change. So I was getting really burnt out. And then the second piece for me is I think I'm really like a great visionary, and I'm a really good motivator, and I'm really good at mentorship. And I am a terrible administrator, and I am a terrible fundraiser. So I think often founders have these great ideas and they're the great catalysts, but eventually when a nonprofit grows big enough, if a founder isn't an administrator, it's no longer the right fit. And they need to step down to let someone who can create more of that sustainable infrastructure step in. So between kind of like my skill set, having run their course, and the burnout sinking in, I literally had, if I'm going to be honest and vulnerable, I literally had a breakdown one night and I was just sobbing and my soul said, enough, it's time to go.
I think it takes a lot of humility, obviously, to walk away from something that you founded and you started. That's so important, though. It's so important for founders or for other people who are just involved in an organization. Sometimes you have to step away. And in those moments too, sometimes you can be even a bigger advocate, a greater advocate for the organization or for the issue, being outside of the bubble of that. But I'm sure it took a lot of humility and courage to walk away and hoping, like fingers crossed, right, that it continues on. Here you've built this thing, you've dedicated so much time to it, but it's really beautiful. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I knew CAASE was going to be in great hands. And what was amazing is that the legal director of CAASE took it over, and she continues to run it, Kate Morris Hoffer, and she's phenomenal. And she loves things I hated, like fundraising and strategic planning. I mean, she's the perfect fit for where CAASE is now. But what was so interesting for me is that I knew that as long as I stayed in Chicago, my identity was always going to be linked with the organization. And so I said to myself, if you're going to emerge, if you're going to evolve, if you're going to really be able to hear what's next for you, you have to leave, because you'll always be Rachel from CAASE in Chicago. And so I got on my motorcycle and I rode around the country, and I landed in this little town in the mountains of Asheville. And again, my soul said, I think this is home. And so that's how I transitioned out of the Midwest and into the mountains of North Carolina.
Tell me about Emerge, because you're doing so much incredible work. And I know that there are threads, right? There are threads to probably the work that you did with CAASE led you on this journey, led you to what you're doing with Emerge. But tell me about Emerge and the great work that you're doing now.
Absolutely. So it was a really specific thread. When I was working at CAASE, I got a phone call from this very boisterous woman, and I just pick up the phone and she's like, my name's Heather. I'm a massage therapist. If one more person calls me for a happy ending, I'm going to lose it. Like, why don't people know that there's trafficking and there's legitimate massage? And I was like, great, let's create a toolkit for massage therapists to help educate the public about the difference. So we worked together, and Heather is amazing. She's also a Reiki master. And for those who are unfamiliar with Reiki, it's a Japanese energy healing modality. And so I thought there are no coincidences. And so I said to her, will you train me in Reiki? And she said, yes, but I have to warn you, it's going to change your entire life. And I thought, no, it's not. And after I got certified, that's when I left CAASE. And that's when I went to Asheville. So I didn't know what I was going to do when I left CAASE. And I definitely had parts of me that thought, find the next big thing, achieve, accomplish. And I created a mantra, which was sit with uncertainty. Just sit with the uncertainty, because if you try to fill this space, you're actually not going to honor what's really meant for you to follow. And so I just sat for a couple months, and I hiked in the mountains, and I tuned in. And then I really got this message. You have this gift of Reiki now. What if you just started to bring it to the community? And so I opened an office, and I said, I'm going to give Reiki sessions to nonprofit professionals for $20 a session, because I want them to have access to something that will help their hearts heal from the impact of the work that they're doing. And so that's how Emerge started. I've gone on to learn 8 different modalities that I work with, everything from hypnosis to emotional freedom techniques or tapping. I do a lot of trauma-based work that has an energetic component, but 80 to 90% of the clients that I see are nonprofit professionals. And so my goal is to help them be sustainable as they're doing the work to heal the world.
That's a beautiful perspective. And even from your own experience as a nonprofit leader, to being able to tap into that and serve that population too. You know, we don't have to recreate the wheel. I feel like everybody wants to be a coach these days, or everybody wants to be a consultant, or everybody wants to be the founder of something. But sometimes in life, the greatest thing that we can do, the greatest impact we can make, is just serving those who are serving too.
Yes, that's what I feel. And my kind of mantra in life is to have people help people have more spaciousness and joy in their lives. And nonprofits can kind of be the antithesis of spaciousness and joy. So I'm the person that's that advocate, that voice for, stop the burnout cycle, take care of yourself, deal with the vicarious trauma that you're going through, and come into this safe space and just be surrounded by this loving energy so that you can go do the heavy lifting in the world.
So when someone reaches out to you, do they usually have an idea of what they're looking for, whether it's Reiki, or do they call you and say, Rachel, this is everything. My life is falling apart. I'm exhausted. I don't know what I need. And then you kind of pull together a plan for them. How does that work?
I think it's a little bit of both, and oftentimes people will come in, they're like, my friend was telling me about this like weird energy thing you do. And I'll just be like, great. So just tell me how I can be of service. And all of a sudden they start listing these things and I'll say, oh, it looks like, there's some pretty intense emotional things going on. Would you be open to trying some tapping on it to see if we can lessen the volume or lower the intensity on that? Or, oh, that seems like a pattern you're stuck in. Would you be open to some hypnosis to see if we can shift the subconscious mind? And so as I always encourage my clients, if you're willing to try my different modalities, then you can become fluent in your own healing kind of plan. And then you can come in and be like, I signed up for this, but I really think I need this today. And then I can just jump in and be of service.
It's so important and we'll speak to women right now since it's the One Girl Revolution podcast, but it's so important for women to find those spaces for healing. And that doesn't just mean therapy, it can mean health and wellness. And, I've had women on this podcast who are nutritionists, and there are so many different facets to our being and to our wellness that it's so beautiful that you're able to serve a lot of different things within your clients.
Oh, I feel so blessed. And also it's lovely I always say to people, you don't use a hammer for every household tool need that you have. So it's really good to have multiple tools that I work with because it helps me kind of refine the work that I do and do more delicate work with people.
So you've done all of this great work with CAASE, and I know you've been involved in other organizations too, the Dreamcatcher Foundation, to name another one that I know of. And then the work that you're doing now, where do you hope that you go from here? I know that the world is your oyster in a lot of ways, and you could do a lot of different things, but do you plan to just keep building on Emerge? What is your hopes and dreams for the next 5 or 10 years and wherever you go from here?
Sure. People often ask me, well, don't you want Emerge to be bigger? And my answer is absolutely not. I love that it's just me, that I can really be present. Having run an organization, it's not something that I ever want to do again. I love the ease that is with my life now. So one big piece of my life is just to continue to show up when new modalities kind of just beautifully come into my life, to learn them, to continue to increase my toolkit for my clients. But while I started doing Emerge, what I simultaneously realized really fueled me as I was helping others was hiking and walking. And so what I found was that the more time I spent on trail, being in silence, kind of listening to what wisdom was out there for me, the more I was able to come back and be of service to people. And so in 2015, I did my first big solo walk, which was the Camino de Santiago. Wow. And walked for a month of my life and had lots of trials and tribulations and a broken leg and all these things that came up from that. But that's what really taught me that for me, walking allows me to be a student of the world and a student of my heart. And so I kept walking. And so I've spent the last 8 years walking the world and just learning from what the world has to teach me. And then I bring those learnings back and then integrate them into my practice. And I actually just wrote a book called While I Walk, Solo Adventuring in the Vast, Beautiful World, about what it has meant to be a learner, a seeker, and a walker, and how that's transformed me. And hopefully it'll inspire some other women to grab a pair of hiking boots and get on a plane and be brave, travel solo, and see what's waiting for them.
That's so beautiful. And I will be sure to put the link to your book in the show notes so people can check it out. But you're just such an inspiration. And I wish that there was more emphasis in the world and the culture for women just to go. Just go. Yeah. If you want to do the Camino, I've always wanted to do the Camino. So I got all excited when you said that. But just to go, and life, there are realities that we can't, sometimes you can't do that, but you can do smaller versions. And that's what I love so much about your stories. You're like, okay, yeah, I want to see all these places. You were telling me before you started recording, just that you have all these hopes and dreams for traveling and things you want to do. And we can all do that. We just need to create the space for it. Save your money. If that's whatever the thing is that's holding you back, whether it's money or time, just do it, figure it out.
Yes. And my biggest hope with what I've chosen to do with the book is that women feel emboldened to go solo. I think there's so many fear narratives about, oh, be careful traveling abroad by yourself, or you're going to get lonely, or it's going to be too intense, or you're not going to know what to do. And it's such a disservice to us because I feel like being alone allows you to really hear your heart and also to increase your resilience. So my hope is that more women will feel like, of course I can, Rachel did all these crazy things. Like if she can do like all this weird stuff, maybe I can just do like a little weekend by myself and start to learn new sides of yourself that way.
I'm sure that you've learned so much about yourself on the Camino and on all of your travels. And especially when you're traveling by yourself, I think that it quiets all the voices inside of us. Right. And like when you don't have, I know different times that I've traveled and I haven't had my phone with me, and it's so refreshing, right? Like every single day we all wake up and it's like, everybody needs something from us. Text messages, phone calls. We always have this long list of people to get back to. Then you have social media channels, right? People are messaging you. But when we quiet those voices or we create these spaces where it's just us, and it can be scary, like you said, it can be scary for a lot of like exterior reasons, but I think also internally, there's a part of us that doesn't really want to get to know who we are. And I think it's so important for us to. Rachel, is there something that like you've learned about yourself that you were surprised by? I'm sure there are a lot of things because you've gone on all these amazing adventures, but is there something that surprised you about who you are as a person that you learned on these travels?
Absolutely. And it started on the Camino. I had this incredibly strong narrative that I'm shy and awkward. I don't like talking to people. Like I'm not good at conversations, all of these things. And, so that was kind of my narrative. And I actually, on my first Camino, hiked so fast because I didn't want anyone to keep up with me that I fractured my shin. And literally, I felt like the Camino kicked me out, said, "You're doing it wrong. Go to therapy, do your work, and then come back and try again." And what I learned was that I'm not shy. I actually love people. I love hearing their stories. I love learning from them. I love being inspired by them. And it completely shifted who I know myself to be in the world by being on trail alone.
Well, I can't wait to read your book. And I know that everybody who's listening is going to want to check it out and read it. And, just to be able to walk alongside you and getting to follow you from now on and follow the great work that you're doing. I know that everyone will be inspired by you and by your story. And I hope that they will get out there and walk. And even if it's just in your neighborhood, like create that space where you can just have peace and enjoy the sunshine. I'm grateful to live in Detroit where the sunshine has finally come out.
Yay!
And hear the birds and just be in nature. We can learn so much about the world and just quiet those voices inside of us. It's so important.
I think that is a beautiful invitation to all your listeners. I love it.
Watch One Girl Revolution's Emmy-nominated short documentary, The Girl Inside, on our YouTube channel or at onegirlrevolution.com. The Girl Inside features a poignant look at the stories of incarcerated women within Cook County Jail and a life-changing academic course taught by Dr. Laura Biaggi called Storytelling as a Healing Art. This short documentary reunites Dr. Biaggi with 5 of her former students for a special one-day course on the transformative power of our stories and our voices. And what is revealed is the girl inside. Watch the Emmy-nominated short documentary, The Girl Inside, today on YouTube or at onegirlrevolution.com. Rachel, you've done so much, obviously, with CAASE and then the Dreamcatcher Foundation, and obviously the work that you're doing now, working with survivors, meaning a lot of different things, right? Not just survivors of human trafficking, survivors of difficulties in life, survivors of traumas. What's the driving force? Like, what is it that drives you to keep wanting to do good in these ways? Maybe it stems back from your childhood and how you were raised, but what's that root that drives you every single day to do this great work?
It's a really great question. I mean, my simplistic answer is I couldn't imagine doing anything else. I had a pretty tumultuous childhood. I had a lot of trauma and had a lot of people help me get through it. And so I understand the gift it is to help people get through the other side of whatever is limiting them. And to me, it's the most joyous work you can do is to help people feel better in the world. So I don't know why I would do anything else than what I do.
That's such a beautiful answer and such a great answer. For people that are listening, what can they do to support CAASE and some of these organizations and spread awareness, right? Like we talked about getting educated, knowing what's out there, putting the number in your phone, donating, of course. But what can people do who are listening? What can they do to get involved in this great advocacy work?
Absolutely. Go on the CAASE website, download a toolkit that resonates with you, bring a group of your friends together, go through it, come up with an action plan, if you're in a book club, read a book about human trafficking. I cannot recommend enough the book Leaving Breezy Street, which was written by my mentor, Brenda Myers-Powell, who started the Dreamcatcher Foundation, which you talked about. And perhaps I'm not supposed to say this, but there will be a film debuting about her at Sundance. So that would be something you could bring a group of girlfriends to, or guy friends. We need to get more men in the movement too. And then just be a voice, when you read something that's a problematic representation of the sex trade industry, write a letter. Stop glamorizing it. To hold accountable advertising organizations that continue to, perpetuate this horrible exploitive rape culture, and just say, I'm not going to buy your products unless you stop, using women's bodies in this horrible way. So just, really kind of fine tuning your awareness, and then just seeing what's your natural way to make a difference and use your voice and use your talent.
It's so important for us to, you hear all these conversations about boycotting, but if you don't speak up, companies don't know. And so it's important for people, like you said, to write letters, use social media. There's so many opportunities that if we see something, say something. And then also, I think it's so important for all of us to speak up when we hear someone or see someone doing something or participating in this. You talked about the demand. How do we end human trafficking? You end the demand. That will stop it. And so we need to be courageous and speak up. And this goes out to both, to everybody. It's not just women to speak up. We need more men to speak up as well.
I agree. And I really advocate for the mothers who are listening to your podcast, especially if they have sons. Talk to your sons about, constructs of masculinity, the pressures they're facing. Talk to them about this issue. Help them be empowered to make better decisions. Because I really do believe that it's men who are the future of changing sexual harm in our country. It should not be the responsibility of those who are victimized to stop.
And children are so powerful. I've had a couple of kids on this podcast who are just doing amazing stuff. And I don't think that we give kids enough credit. Oftentimes parents are like, I can't talk about that with them until they're whatever age. And it's like, well, they're at school and they're learning it anyways. So we have the power to teach kids to be beautiful beacons of hope and light, and to even challenge their other classmates, right? So teaching boys to be good stewards and to be respectful of other human beings, and to take care of one another and just be that example. Kids have so much power in this culture.
Yes. And I think we need to honor that. And then we also need to help them harness that. And they're going to have, the next generation is going to have much better ideas about what to do about this issue than we do. So I think it's also really important to create space at the table for the younger generation.
Yeah, exactly. So you work so much with survivors of different traumas, and maybe there's someone who's listening who hasn't found healing. And I'm a firm believer that we're healing our entire lives, right? You don't just go through a trauma and move beyond it, right? It's almost like a scar that you carry on. Yes, it heals, but it's something that you carry that's a part of you. I know you've been through a lot in your life. What advice would you give to someone? And I know every person's story is different, but what advice would you give to someone who maybe hasn't even started that healing journey? What advice would you give them?
Sure. I would say be really open to the different kind of pathways to healing. I think oftentimes people think, I have to get a therapist. And then they go to therapy and it doesn't quite resonate. And you can start with something much more gentle. Go get an energy clearing treatment. See how it even feels to start becoming embodied again. Try somatic experiencing. There's such a beautiful array of healing options that we have now that it doesn't have to be that traditional talk therapy that's not everyone's fit. Even if it's just a massage when you're not used to having just, restorative touch. So I would say try something, that's a little bit more comfortable. And then as you get more into that momentum of healing, then you can see what else might resonate for you.
There's so many things out there now, even the art therapy, music therapy, there's so much. And so I encourage everybody who's listening, find the thing, like you said, the modality that works for you and try it. And worst case scenario, you do something once and you don't like it and it's not a good fit. Cool. You can move on to the next thing. But I think it's important for us to build our army and build our support system and also build the modalities of things that help us in this life.
I agree. And if we're going to have, amazing radical women in the long run, we need to take care of ourselves so we can keep being on this path.
We do, because it's hard every single day. It's difficult to stand up every single day and speak up. And so to also find those moments and find that time and find the things that feed your soul and feed your body and, just keep doing it. That gives you a moment of reprieve so you can go back. But Rachel, I'm so excited to have you on to share your incredible story. I will post the link to your book and some of the things that you mentioned so people can easily find it. And I'd love to stay in touch with you and keep following all of your journey and all the great stuff that you're doing. But before I let you go, I always end this podcast on 2 questions. So the first one is, you're a one girl revolution. That's why I wanted to have you on this podcast. You're amazing. You have changed the world in so many ways already. And I know that there's so much before you and so many different ways that you're going to change the world from here on out for the rest of your life and even beyond, right? Like our legacy continues even after us. But who is a one girl revolution in your life? Who's a woman or girl that inspires you?
So when you told me that would be a question, the first person who came to mind was my sister. And my sister is kind of, I think she is the essence of a radical woman, because she is taking on kind of this dynastic privilege among wealthy Jewish families and challenging Jews to be more equitable, to be more social justice minded, and to be more kind of self-critical about these empires that have been created. And so, it's a real treacherous ground, because she's often accused of being anti-Jew and anti-Israel and anti-this, anti-that. But she knows that it's so important that if we don't break down these old ways of doing so that we can introduce more revolutionary ways of kind of addressing social injustice, we're really just perpetuating issues instead of solving them. So I think she's incredibly brave, incredibly brilliant, and I'm constantly inspired by her willingness to be vulnerable and to take on really a challenging issue.
That's amazing. And what an honor to honor her on this podcast. So thank you for sharing about your sister. And then I always end this podcast on this question. So I'd like to ask you, if you could leave women and girls around the world with one message, what would it be?
Make time for silence. Even if it's scary, even if you don't know what's inside, because if we don't do our internal exploration, we really can't reach our full potential in the external world. So as you said, whatever that silence is, whether it's on a meditation chair, whether it's a walk around the neighborhood, whether it's scuba diving, any way you can get to silence so that you can hear your heart and your truth, make room for that in your lives.
Well, Rachel, I feel so rejuvenated and ready to start a revolution after talking to you. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. And thank you so much for all of the incredible work that you do.
Thank you. This was a delight. I'm really grateful.
Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at One Girl Revo. That's the number 1 Girl REVO. And you can find more information on One Girl Revolution at onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number 1 girlrevolution.com.